Okay, so let's unpack this. You've brought us into, well, what sounds like a really intense online space,
Huh?
where these complex, deeply sensitive issues can just escalate instantly.
Yeah, 0 to 60, basically.
And the subject right at the center of this particular storm, the filmmaker, Roman Polanski. Acclaimed, yes, but also controversial, convicted.
Absolutely. But we're not just, generally talking about him today.
Right? We're diving deep, really deep,
Wow.
into a stack of sources you've shared, and these are mostly chat logs documenting a very specific, apparently highly charged conversation.
That's it. Chat logs plus some really detailed analytical notes someone took, kind of dissecting that whole exchange. It gives us this fascinating, sometimes pretty uncomfortable window into how real people grapple with these incredibly difficult topics.
Things like crime, justice,
Yeah.
how we think about victim perspectives, accountability,
Mm.
and just the long shadow actions from the past can cast.
Exactly. And these sources, they aren't just a transcript, They're like a microscopic look at how this one specific group navigated a total minefield of a topic.
So our mission for this deep dive, it's quite focused then.
Very focused. We are here specifically to unpack and really thoroughly examine the arguments that were presented within this debate. We're going to pay a particular attention to the points raised, trying to, well, defend Polanski, or argue against any further pursuit of justice.
And just as critically, we'll lay out the direct counter-arguments, right? The context that other people in the chat provided.
Absolutely. And we're sticking meticulously, really strictly, to the information presented in this source material. We're not bringing in outside stuff. This is about understanding this specific conversation.
Okay. And a really vital point up front, especially given what you've said about the sources, is obviously a sensitive topic. The language, the viewpoints and the sources themselves, they sound pretty stark, uncompromising.
Oh, definitely. Especially when discussing the crimes, the alleged crimes, and the defenses people raised against calls for accountability. It gets heated.
So we want to be clear with you, the listener. Our tone in this deep dive, it's going to reflect our role here, which is basically guiding you through these specific sources. We're going to adopt an analytical and, yes, a critical tone towards the arguments presented in these sources, especially when those arguments seem to justify or dismiss really serious actions.
And that critical stance, it's important to stress, is drawn directly from the analysis that's present in the material itself. It's not just our opinion.
Right. We are here to understand these arguments and these specific rebuttals exactly as they were presented in this particular very charged exchange.
Think of us as, I don't know, anthropologists of online debate for the next little while. We're examining the artifacts of this conversation, the arguments, the claims, the counterclaims, to understand the dynamics within it.
So we're not endorsing the opinions in the chat necessarily.
Not at all. But we are presenting them and the counterarguments to really get a handle on the contours of this specific debate as it's documented in these sources.
Got it. Makes sense.
Okay.
Okay, so analyzing the source material, what's the core tension? What really ignites this whole thing? Where's the fundamental disagreement?
Well, the central clash, and the source notes are really clear on this, it revolves around one participant. The source calls him Justin.
Okay, Justin.
And Justin's primary approach, his main line, is basically defending Roman Polanski. And he does this mostly by centering the stated wishes, the feelings of Samantha Geimer. She's the victim in that original 1977 case.
Right, the case everyone knows.
Exactly. And opposing him, you've got this group of other participants who are arguing pretty vehemently for Polanski's accountability. And their point is this need for accountability stands, regardless of what one victim's current stance might be on the legal side of things.
And the sources make it clear right away. This isn't just a polite difference of opinion. It's described as a stark, fundamental divide from the very beginning.
Oh, absolutely. The source material describing the mood of the chat is crucial here. It doesn't paint a picture of a, calm, reasoned discussion.
No, as it's described.
It's characterized explicitly as heated, tense, and confrontational. And the notes really emphasize that this atmosphere is punctuated constantly by personal attacks, lots of name-calling, sarcasm, particularly aimed at Justin.
Wow.
Yeah, and strong language just generally throughout the whole exchange. So that immediately tells you something about the nature of the arguments we're about to explore. These aren't just intellectual points being calmly debated. They're deeply emotional. They're volatile.
That mood description is definitely key then. It sets the stage for why these arguments are maybe delivered with such force and sometimes with language that's, well, less than civil. as the sources document.
It certainly does. It really underscores that for these participants, this is a high-stakes debate. Positions are held with real conviction, and the goal often isn't just clarification. It's about dismantling the other person's viewpoint.
Okay, so let's dive into what the sources highlight as the real heart of this disagreement. You said it comes down to basically two completely different ways of interpreting what it means to listen to victims.
This, according to the source notes, is really the bedrock of the whole conflict. The notes explicitly draw this really sharp contrast between how Justin interprets that phrase and how another participant, named Billy Elliot in the sources, sees it.
Billy Elliot, okay.
And these two views, they essentially represent the two poles of the debate, as described in these source documents.
All right, let's break down Justin's interpretation first. Drawing directly from what the sources say he argued and what the notes say about his stance. How does he define listening to victims?
Okay, so based on the source notes and his direct quotes in the chat logs, Justin's definition is, well, it's very specific. And according to the source's analysis, pretty restrictive. He seems to equate listening to victims directly with stopping all legal action, stopping any kind of criticism, even stopping public discussion of the case.
Really, just stopping everything.
Pretty much. His focus is almost entirely exclusively on respecting Samantha Geimer's stated wishes, her desire to drop the case, to just move on with her life.
And he takes that pretty far, right? To the point where he sees any attempt to prosecute Polanski as actually being harassment aimed at Geimer herself.
Exactly. That's a key part of his argument as presented. He frames any continuation of the legal pursuit, or even just talking about it publicly, as a violation of her autonomy, as something that causes further trauma for her. The sources quote him saying things like, all I'm saying is Geimer doesn't want to be part of it at this point, and he insists, quite forcefully apparently, on the need to leave her alone. His whole argument, as it's laid out in the sources, is really narrowly focused on Geimer's current feelings, her desire to put the past behind her, avoid any more court proceedings.
How does he phrase that?
He sums it up by saying something like, she feels it's resolved on her side, so why not do something useful then rather than harass her against her wishes? And that statement, according to the source analysis, is the absolute core of how he frames the entire issue. Her feeling of resolution, her desire for peace, should basically end all external action or discussion. Full stop.
Wow. Okay, that is indeed a very specific and, as the sources suggest, quite a restrictive definition of listening to victims. So how does Billy Elliot's interpretation, as described in the sources, stand in contrast to that?
Well, Billy Elliot presents what the sources characterize as a much broader and, crucially, a legally distinct counterargument. For Billy Elliot, listening to victims means something fundamentally different. It means believing their accounts of the crime, acknowledging the trauma, the harm they experience.
Okay, believing their story.
Yes. But crucially, his interpretation, as is presented in the sources, explicitly separates that act of believing and acknowledging from the victim having any kind of, control over the legal system or dictating its response.
I see.
He explicitly states this, and this quote is highlighted in the sources. He says, listening to victims means listening to them about what happened crime, not how the justice system should work.
So it's about validating their truth, their experience of the crime itself, but not giving them the power to decide how the state pursues justice for that crime. Is that it?
Precisely. Billy Elliot's view, as documented in the sources, recognizes that while, individual forgiveness or a victim's desire to move on, that's absolutely valid. It's important for personal healing. But it does not, and legally cannot, absolve the perpetrator of the crime itself in the eyes of the law. It doesn't dictate the state's responsibility to enforce criminal statutes.
He makes that distinction clear.
Very clear, according to the chat logs. He says, she can live her life however she wants, but Roman Polanski has to go to jail. That really highlights his focus on the state's role, the perpetrator's ongoing legal liability, totally separate from the victim's personal journey or feelings about prosecution.
And this broader perspective he has, it isn't just limited to the specifics of the Geimer case, according to the sources. He looks beyond that.
No, it isn't limited. Billy Elliot and others in the chat who seem to share his viewpoint, they extend their perspective beyond just this one case from 1977. The sources show they bring up the broader context, other accusations against Polanski. They express concern about, the potential for future harm.
He uses strong language about that.
He does. Billy Elliot explicitly states that he sees Polanski as a predator. He says Roman Polanski is a predator, though, and that I do care about. So that really demonstrates that for these participants, the issue is much larger than just how the 1977 case resolved for Geimer personally. It encompasses what they see as a pattern of behavior, and it's a broader call for accountability for someone they view as dangerous.
Okay. And the source notes themselves, the analysis part, they offer a summary of this fundamental divide.
Yeah.
How do they frame the core difference between Justin's interpretation and the counter-arguments?
Yeah, the source notes analyze this divide pretty directly. They characterize Justin's interpretation, his specific use of listening to victims, as primarily serving as a justification for inaction, for silence regarding Polanski's accountability.
So it's seen as a way to shut down the discussion.
According to the notes, yes. This specific framing allows Justin, within the context of the debate, to effectively deflect criticism related to Polanski's actions. He does it by invoking the victim's stated wishes. It becomes a shield almost.
And in contrast, how do the notes describe Billy Elliott's perspective and those challenging Justin?
In contrast, the source notes describe their perspective as a call for understanding the victim's experience, yes, but alongside a demand for broader accountability, for systemic change even. This perspective, again drawn directly from the sources, emphasizes that the pursuit of justice is seen as a societal imperative, something that can, and maybe should, continue even if it appears to conflict with a single victim's current preference about prosecution.
That really does lay bare the fundamental disagreement, doesn't it? It's not just about words. It's about the whole purpose of the justice system and the individual's place within it. Okay, let's move on then. How does this core disagreement play out in the more specific arguments Justin raised? And how did others in the chat, drawing from the sources, systematically push back against those? His first major line of defense seems to be centered on Geimer's forgiveness and this idea that the case is resolved.
Yes, this is definitely presented in the sources as a cornerstone of Justin's position. He repeatedly brings up Samantha Geimer's public statements, her actions, as basically proof that the matter is concluded, it's done, and Polanski should just be left alone.
What kind of things does he say specifically?
The sources quote him making claims like, Geimer herself forgave him for the record. He asserts that she felt that he paid his debt to society. He also insists that it was settled out of court and it's her decision, and makes this really definitive statement. She does not want it to continue. For him, these are presented as sufficient reasons to just end any public or legal pursuit of Polanski.
Okay, so how do the other participants in the chat respond? Drawing on different facts, different principles from the sources, how do they counter those specific claims?
Well, the counter-arguments from the others, as they're documented in the sources, are pretty multifaceted. They directly challenge Justin's premises on several fronts. First, they really hammer home the distinction between personal forgiveness and legal accountability.
Right, the point Billy Elliott made.
Exactly. While they acknowledge Geimer's absolute right to forgive for her own healing, her own peace of mind, they argue pretty forcefully that this personal act doesn't just nullify the criminal act itself. It doesn't absolve Polanski in the eyes of the law.
How do they put that?
One participant counters Justin's framing very directly, very starkly, saying, that's cool, still rape and fleeing. Just highlighting that the crime happened regardless of any forgiveness that came later. The fact remains.
And they push back strongly on this idea that the victim's feelings should dictate the state's prosecution. That seems central.
Oh, absolutely. This is a central point of contention raised by the others, and it seems drawn from just a fundamental understanding of criminal law as it's depicted in the source discussion. They argue that the criminal justice system isn't about the victim's feelings, primarily. It's a matter between the state and the accused. It represents society's interest in upholding laws protecting its members. It's not a system controlled by the individual victim's wishes.
Are there specific quotes on that?
Yeah, quotes from the chat like, yeah, justice isn't about the feelings of the victim, and even more pointedly, criminal law, surprisingly, shouldn't be decided by the victim. These are used to really underscore this principle and directly challenge Justin's whole framing of the issue. They highlight that while victim input is definitely important, it doesn't grant someone veto power over state prosecution, especially for serious felony crimes.
Okay, and this is where that crucial detail from the sources about the original case settlement comes in, right? Because it seems to directly contradict Justin's claim that the case was just settled out of court and that was the final resolution.
Yes, exactly. This is a really vital piece of information that's present in the sources and used effectively by the participants challenging Justin. A participant explicitly points out that the judge in the original 1977 case actually rejected the plea deal. That deal included a settlement component.
The judge rejected it.
Rejected it. The source quotes this fact directly. The judge rejected the settlement. And this detail is used to argue that the criminal case was not simply settled out of court with judicial approval, like it was some final resolved matter in the way Justin seems to imply.
So what does that rejection signify in their argument?
It indicates that the judicial system at that time viewed the proposed resolution as insufficient, as not meeting the demands of justice. And that rejection, they argue, is what led Polanski to flee before he could be formally sentenced after his guilty plea to unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor. It wasn't a neat resolution, it was an escape from pending and potentially more severe consequences.
Right. And speaking of fleeing, it's not like Polanski went on to serve his full sentence later, did he?
Oh, far from it. According to all the details shared and emphasized in these sources, participants repeatedly stress this. Polanski is a convicted offender who became a fugitive by fleeing the U.S. before his sentencing could even be completed.
And the details of that sentence he started.
The sources detail he pleaded guilty to unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor and then fled after serving only, 42 days of a 90-day diagnostic sentence? Just 42 days? The phrase "en piste" is actually used in the chat, kind of underscoring the deliberate nature of his flight.
En piste. Okay.
Yeah, and the idea that he's now just, chilling in France, where he lives and works freely, that's explicitly contrasted in the source debate with the notion that he somehow paid any debt. The argument from others is clear. Chilling in France isn't paying a debt.
So his fugitive status is central to why this is still being debated.
Absolutely. They argue it's central. He actively evaded the consequences the system was attempting to impose. That's why these discussions about accountability are still happening decades later, because he thwarted the process.
Okay. Now there's also, according to the sources, significant skepticism raised within the chat about the settlement itself, particularly connecting it to power dynamics, Polanski's wealth.
Yes, the sources clearly show the skepticism was a strong undercurrent in the counter-arguments against Justin's points. Participants definitely questioned whether Polanski's considerable wealth played a role in Samantha Geimer's later stance, or her public statements about wanting the case dropped.
How was that expressed?
Well, the sources detail explicit comments from the chat like, or got a big paycheck, who knows, which directly raises the possibility that money influenced her position. And the source notes themselves provide some specific factual details here about the civil settlement amount.
What were the numbers?
The notes say $604,416 owed in 1996, confirmed settled by 1997 via confidential arrangement. And they even calculate the equivalent in modern terms, $1.1 million in today bucks.
Wow, over $1 million in today's money.
Yeah. And this factual detail drawn from the source is then used within the chat debate to fuel comments like, her price was $1 million, and someone else saying, I'd drop charges for $1 million. These comments really highlight the participants' suspicion that wealth could be used to essentially buy silence or facilitate the evasion of justice.
But it's important to be clear here, right? The sources are documenting these suspicions raised in the chat, not necessarily stating them as proven fact about Geimer's motivations.
That's a crucial distinction the source material itself seems to make, yes. These are arguments and suspicions raised within the heat of the debate by participants trying to counter Justin's narrative. They reflect the skepticism present in that conversation about the influence of power and wealth, rather than a definitive statement of fact from the source notes themselves.
Understood. And the participants also draw a clear legal distinction, don't they? Settling a civil case versus resolving criminal charges.
Absolutely. This is another key legal principle that participants use, as shown in the sources, to really dismantle Justin's argument about the case being settled. They emphasize that the civil settlement, which was confidential, related to damages, financial compensation, is entirely separate from the criminal charges brought by the state of California.
They call him out on that specifically.
Yes. Quotes like, settling out of court is for civil lawsuits, and you know that, are used to assert that Justin is either misunderstanding or perhaps deliberately misrepresenting this crucial legal difference. They argue that allowing civil settlements to just negate criminal offenses would be, well, catastrophic for the justice system.
How do they put that?
One participant says, if people could just, oops, I don't want to press charges out of criminal offenses, the amount of corruption that would encourage in the system is ridiculous. This really illustrates how participants in the chat use basic legal reasoning, as documented in the sources, to push back hard against Justin's claims about the case being simply settled and therefore closed.
Okay, so that covers the case is resolved argument pretty thoroughly. Let's move to Justin's second major line of argument, which the sources describe as framing any pursuit or even discussion of the case as harassment specifically directed at Geimer.
Right. This is a recurring point made by Justin, as documented in the sources, and it ties back directly to his very specific interpretation of listening to victims. He consistently frames any continued attention to the case as actively harming Geimer.
What kind of language does he use?
He claims it's traumatizing rape victims even further against their wishes, and specifically accuses others of harassing her against her wishes. He even tries to shift the blame for this alleged harassment onto the legal system itself, claiming the court is harassing her just by seeking prosecution. He positions any discussion or action aimed at Polanski's accountability as basically telling Geimer how to live her life.
That's a strong accusation that discussing accountability is harassing the victim. How do the other participants in the chat, according to the sources, respond to this?
Well, the counter-arguments presented in the sources fundamentally reject this framing outright. Participants argue that seeking justice for a serious felony crime, or even just debating accountability online, is simply not harassment. And particularly, it's not harassment of Geimer in this context.
How do they express that rejection?
One participant's reaction, documented as pretty intense, leads them to direct their anger specifically at Justin's perspective. They say something like, "My anger is entirely directed towards you and your shit takes." Bringing that up in that context is defending Polanski.
So they see it as a defense tactic for Polanski, not genuine concern for Geimer.
Exactly. That comment shows they perceive Justin's claim not as authentic concern for the victim's well-being, but as a rhetorical tactic designed to shut down any criticism of Polanski by invoking Geimer's name and alleged trauma.
And they also point out the literal distance between the chat discussion and Geimer herself.
Right.
They're not actually talking to her.
Precisely. That's a key, very practical counterpoint raised in the chat. It's the simple reality that the participants are in an online chat room discussing a public figure. They are not interacting with Samantha Geimer. They're not directing their comments at her. They're having a discussion about Roman Polanski's actions and the broader principle of accountability.
What do they say to make that clear?
Participants explicitly state things like, "She's not here, we're not telling her anything," and even more bluntly, "and in fact, we aren't even trying to talk about her, lol." They argue, as documented in the sources, that Justin is essentially, maybe intentionally, redefining the word harassment in a way that serves to create an emotional shield for Polanski and shut down legitimate criticism of his actions and fugitive status.
They accuse him of doing it intentionally.
Yeah, there are quotes like, "You are intentionally doing this," and one participant expresses clear incredulity, saying, "You literally think that prosecuting her rapist is harassing her." These comments really highlight how others in the chat perceived his argument not just as wrong, but as a disingenuous tactic.
But there's also a more nuanced point raised, isn't there? That it's actually possible to respect Geimer's personal journey, her healing, while still advocating for Polanski to face legal consequences.
Yes, that more complex perspective is definitely present in the sources. Some participants argue that these two things are not mutually exclusive. You can absolutely acknowledge and respect Geimer's desire to move on, to heal on her own terms, find her own peace, while simultaneously maintaining that Polanski, as a convicted fugitive, should still be held accountable by the justice system he fled from.
So that directly challenges Justin's framing.
It does. It challenges his framing that any pursuit of accountability is, by definition, harming Geimer. They're saying, no, we can hold both thoughts, we can respect her, while still demanding justice for the crime committed and for the act of fleeing.
And the sources also show that they challenge Justin's own consistency on this whole point of leaving Geimer alone, don't they?
Oh, they absolutely do. Seems, well, selectively applied. He himself is actively and very publicly participating in this heated debate to defend Polanski.
Yeah.
And he's using Geimer's stated wishes as the primary basis for that defense, which, ironically, inherently involves bringing up her case, her history, her statements over and over again. So by his own definition of leaving her alone, his actions could be seen as failing to do that.
So they point out that inconsistency.
Yes. That inconsistency between his own actions and his stated principle is used by others in the chat to question the sincerity, or at least the consistency, of his whole "don't harass Geimer" argument.
Okay. Let's move to his third main argument, as it's presented in the sources. This one shifts focus slightly. Why not pursue the other cases instead? The idea being, if people are so concerned about accountability, focus elsewhere.
Right. This is framed by Justin, according to the sources, as a more useful, maybe more logical approach if the other participants genuinely want to see accountability for Polanski. He suggests they should direct their energy towards the other allegations against Polanski rather than continuing to harp on Geimer's case, which, in his view, she considers closed and resolved.
How is this argument countered by others in the chat based on the source material?
The counterarguments here are several. First, participants argue that the principle of holding Polanski accountable shouldn't be selective. It should apply to all credible allegations and proven instances of misconduct, not just focusing on some while ignoring others, simply because it suits a particular defense tactic.
And they also point out the practical absurdity of his suggestion, given the context.
Yes, they highlight the practical limitations of their position as participants in an online chat. As one participant points out, really highlighting the absurdity, we can't pursue anything because he is literally a fugitive. The point being made is that this debate they're having is the extent of the pursuit that private citizens in this context can realistically engage in regarding a high-profile international fugitive living abroad. Telling them to pursue other cases is meaningless in practical terms for them.
Right. It's not like they can just launch an investigation.
Exactly. And they also use this argument from Justin to question his own consistency again. Why accept Geimer's word as the absolute reason to drop discussion of her case, but then seemingly implicitly dismiss or ignore other accusers?
How do they phrase that challenge?
Well, comments like, "the ones who lied," are used by others, according to the source notes. This implies they see Justin as selectively accepting or dismissing victim accounts based entirely on whether those accounts support his defense of Polanski, rather than applying a consistent principle of actually listening to victims across the board.
Okay. Now, the sources also introduce a specific legal case, one initiated by Polanski himself, that seems highly relevant here, the Matan Uziel libel case. This sounds like it was used in the chat to further counter Justin's focus on other cases argument.
This is indeed a really important detail drawn from the sources and apparently leveraged quite effectively by participants challenging Justin. The source notes detail how Roman Polanski actually sued an Israeli journalist named Matan Uziel.
Sued him for what?
For libel in Israel, because Uziel's website listed other women who had made public accusations against Polanski over the years.
And what happened with that lawsuit?
The sources state that Polanski ultimately dropped the lawsuit, but crucially, he was ordered to pay Uziel's court costs.
And wasn't there a specific ruling in that case that's important? Something about preventing future lawsuits?
Precisely. This is key. The source notes explicitly state that the court accepted Uziel's request that the suit be formally rejected rather than just simply dropped or withdrawn by Polanski.
Why is rejected significant?
Because, as the source notes explain, this legal rejection effectively prevented Polanski from suing Uziel again in the future over the publication of the exact same information regarding these other accusers. It set a precedent, at least in that jurisdiction, regarding that specific publication.
So how did participants use this in the chat against Justin?
They use this information, drawn from the sources, as evidence that Polanski himself has actively tried to suppress public discussion of other allegations through legal intimidation, and that this specific attempt actually failed in court. So, it directly counters Justin's suggestion that others should just focus on the other cases, by pointing out that Polanski himself has legally fought against exactly that kind of public discussion.
That's a powerful counterpoint. The sources also list specific examples of these other accusers mentioned in the chat, right? Seemingly to underscore that Geimer is not an isolated case, that other serious allegations exist and are part of the public record.
Yes, the source notes explicitly include a section titled Other Allegations. And they list the names of individuals who were brought up during the chat discussion, noting that this information was likely drawn from publicly available sources like Wikipedia by the participants.
Who was mentioned?
The names listed in the source notes include Charlotte Lewis, Renate Langer, Marianne Barnard, and Valentine Monnier.
And why is listing them significant in the context of this deep dive?
Their inclusion and mention within the source material serve to provide crucial context to the debate. It counters any implication, intended or not, that the discussion should be solely confined to the 1977 Geimer case. It highlights that there are other publicly known, seemingly credible accusations against Polanski that are absolutely relevant to any discussion about his overall accountability, potential patterns of behavior, and fitness to be celebrated or defended.
Okay. Stepping back a bit from the specific point-by-point arguments,
Yeah.
the sources also spend considerable time detailing Polanski's history of evading justice, specifically as it was discussed in this conversation. This seems like important background context for the whole debate.
Oh, this context is absolutely critical, and it's heavily emphasized throughout the source material. The sources constantly reiterate Polanski's undisputed legal status in the United States. He is a convicted offender, and he is a fugitive from justice.
And the specifics mentioned repeatedly in the chat, and notes are key, right?
Yes. Convicted of unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor, based on his own guilty plea. Fled the country before he could be formally sentenced. Served only that very limited 42 days of a 90-day diagnostic sentence in a prison facility before he left the U.S. Never came back to face the judge.
And the sources highlight an argument from the chat that he owes time just for the act of fleeing itself, separate from the original crime he pleaded guilty to.
Yes, that's a distinct legal point raised and emphasized by participants in the chat, as documented clearly in the sources. The source explicitly states the view expressed. At this point, he owes time in jail for the fleeing itself.
So it's like a second offense.
Essentially, yes. It underscores the argument that Polanski didn't just avoid completing a sentence for the original crime. He committed a separate crime by absconding, by deliberately thwarting the entire legal process. And this status as a fugitive who intentionally obstructed justice is, according to the arguments presented in the sources, central to why participants in the chat feel so compelled to discuss accountability even decades later. The formal legal avenue was effectively blocked by Polanski's own actions.
The sources also include arguments from the chat participants framing Polanski not just as someone who committed a single crime back in the 70s, but as someone they view as a predator with a pattern of behavior. And crucially, that this pattern and his evasion of justice are seen as being enabled by factors like his immense wealth and the specific social circles he moves in.
This perspective is very strongly represented and articulated in the source material. Participants use stark, unambiguous language. Quotes like, "He's an absolute predator," appear in the logs, and the argument is explicitly made that his ability to evade consequences, to continue working, to receive awards even, is directly linked to his resources and the environments he inhabits.
What kind of environments?
The source notes paraphrase or, quote, arguments stating that his behavior is enabled by his wealth, he's filthy rich, and also by microcultures that enable his pedophilia. This seems to refer to specific social or perhaps industry circles where his actions were overlooked, excused, or even facilitated.
And this connects to the lack of consequences.
Directly. A participant emphasizes the long-term lack of any real consequences, stating he's literally never had to actually sit through a punishment for any of it. And this observation leads, in the source's documentation of the chat, to this really chilling, provocative conclusion offered by one participant. Why would he stop raping underage girls? The world has literally never given him a reason to.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. This analysis, drawn from the source material, really frames the debate not just around a single historical event, but around a perceived ongoing pattern of behavior and the systemic failures that allow powerful individuals to avoid accountability.
Exactly. It elevates the conversation documented in the chat from just the simple rehashing of a famous past case to a much broader discussion. It becomes about power dynamics, about enabling cultures, about the real-world consequences of not holding certain individuals accountable, especially when they have the means to evade the formal justice system entirely.
Okay. Now, the sources also dedicate a significant portion, as you mentioned earlier, to detailing the tone and the specific tactics used in this debate. We know it's described as heated, tense, and confrontational.
They really drilled down into the actual nature of the exchange itself. The notes go into pretty explicit detail describing the chat as being absolutely filled with personal attacks, name-calling, and sarcasm. And they note this was particularly directed at Justin, often seemingly in direct response to his defenses of Polanski.
And the sources don't mince words. They actually list the specific insults used.
No, they don't shy away from it at all. The source material includes a list of the explicit insults participants directed at Justin, which really reflect the extreme frustration and, frankly, contempt that was being felt towards his arguments in that moment.
What kind of insults are we talking about?
He was called disgusting, imbecile, moron, idiot, cunt, and accused of having a fucking disgusting attitude. It's pretty raw.
Definitely. Were others targeted too?
The notes mention others were targeted, though maybe less frequently or intensely. Terms like low-level troll were used. Someone was described as autistic in their communication style as a criticism, and someone else called a psycho. This raw language, documented directly in the sources, just vividly illustrates the sheer emotional intensity of this exchange.
Yeah, that level of personal attack certainly underlines the description of a volatile and emotionally charged exchange. The sources also specifically call out several zingers, these sharp, often sarcastic remarks used in the debate. Let's maybe unpack a few of those in their context as the source notes analyze them.
Okay. Yeah, the source notes analyze these specific remarks for their argumentative or rhetorical purpose within this really heated discussion. The first zinger mentioned seems directed squarely at Justin's constant focus on Geimer. Gamer? Well, why didn't you say so? I hardly know her.
Okay, how does the source explain that one?
The source explains this as a mocking response. It plays on that common dismissive, sarcastic phrase, I hardly know her. It's used here, the note suggests, to ridicule Justin's perceived over-reliance on just invoking Dahmer's name, while simultaneously and ironically minimizing her actual experience through this sort of pretense of ignorance. It's like a way for the participant to say, you keep throwing her name out as your only argument, but doing that makes you lose sight of the actual gravity here, delivered through really biting humor and dismissal.
Right. Then there's one that uses a very stark and potentially controversial analogy.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the zinger. So I guess we shouldn't bring that shit up in school anymore, innit? The source notes analyze this as heavy, heavy sarcasm. It's intended to highlight what the speaker sees as the flawed logic in Justin's argument by applying it to other universally condemned historical atrocities.
Like what?
The source notes explicitly connect this to a hypothetical Holocaust analogy that participants apparently used earlier in the chat. The point being made was, just as individual forgiveness, or the mere passage of time, doesn't erase the historical truth or the need for remembrance and accountability for something like the Holocaust, Samantha Geimer's forgiveness, as Justin frames it, or her desire to move on, doesn't just erase the fact of the crime Polanski committed or his status as a fugitive. It's a really provocative comparison designed to show the perceived absurdity of applying Justin's reasoning more broadly.
Understood. The note describing Justin's approach as autistic also includes a pointed zinger that analyzes his communication style within the debate itself.
Right, that's the note, and Zinger stating, I feel like Justin autistically heard this phrase once and missed the point, and now he just repeats it as a mantra because he has no idea listening to victims. The source notes explain this as a very specific critique within the debate of Justin's perceived argumentative style.
How do the notes interpret the use of autistically there?
As analyzed by the source notes, the use of the term characterizes his approach in this specific debate as rigid, lacking nuance, and just repetitively clinging to that one phrase, listening to victims, without showing, in their view, a deeper understanding of its complexities or the counter-arguments being thrown at him. It's presented in the source material as essentially an ad hominem attack, but one rooted in a critique of his perceived inability or unwillingness to engage with the opposing arguments in a flexible, responsive way. It's crucial to stress this is the source's documentation and analysis of a term used within the debate to criticize his communication style, reflecting the harshness of the exchange, not an external diagnosis.
Got it. There's also a darkly humorous zinger mentioned that references Polanski's past crime and the environment often associated with him back then.
Ah, yes, that's the sarcastic suggestion offered. Might I suggest a Lolita remake in Jack Nicholson's house? Lolita, directed by Rami P. The source note explicitly analyzes this as dark, biting humor.
What elements is it combining there?
It's a sarcastic proposition that deliberately combines the title of a famous work dealing with the sexualization of a minor, Lomita, with the specific crime Polanski pleaded guilty to involving a minor. And then it places it geographically in Jack Nicholson's house, which is a widely circulated detail from the actual events of the 1977 crime. This sinner, as interpreted by the source notes, simultaneously references the nature of the crime, Polanski's direct involvement, and alludes quite strongly to the alleged enabling environment among certain Hollywood elites at the time, adding a layer of sharp social commentary through really provocative, dark humor.
The zinger that succinctly summarizes the perceived core absurdity of Justin's isolated stance. That one seems quite powerful in the context described.
It's very effective, yeah, in capturing the dynamic as perceived by the other participants. It goes, entire chat. Man, we hate rapists and they shouldn't get off one dude. Leave Samantha alone.
How does the source explain its impact?
The source note explains this as a concise, almost humorous summary of the core disagreement. It dramatically isolates Justin's position, contrasting it very sharply with what the speaker portrays as the overwhelming consensus of the majority in the chat, expressed very simply as hating rapists and believing they should face consequences. The zinger really highlights the perceived isolation and, from the perspective of those using it, the sheer absurdity of Justin's singular focus on leaving Geimer alone when faced with these broader arguments about Polanski's actions, his fugitive status, and the principle of accountability.
And then there's a zinger that kind of satirizes the whole online discussion itself, right?
Right.
Acknowledging its limitations compared to actual real-world action.
That's the one referencing fictional detectives. Detective fucking Nick and Inspector Twim aren't going to go knocking on his door. Justice served, lads, let's go home. The source note describes this as pure sarcasm, used to mock the idea that simply having a really heated debate about Polanski online somehow equates to achieving meaningful, real-world justice against a fugitive who is, practically speaking, living well outside the reach of U.S. law enforcement.
So it highlights the frustration.
Exactly. It highlights the disconnect between the intense virtual engagement and anger of the chat participants and the very real, practical difficulties of achieving legal consequences for someone who fled the jurisdiction years ago. It implicitly acknowledges the frustration and maybe the impotence inherent in their situation.
Finally, the source notes point out a multi-part zinger that acts almost as meta-commentary on the whole chaotic exchange.
Yes, that zinger really captures a moment of self-awareness, maybe cynical self-awareness, among the participants about the nature of their own debate. It goes, something so unbelievably stupid and morons who will argue for or against it with every fiber of their being. Welcome to the Whoverse Game Jing, about to be dethroned for top stupid fucking conversation. Watch out, John.
Okay, what's the analysis there? Who versus Game Jing?
The source notes analyze this as explicit meta-commentary. It reflects a moment where participants seem to step back from the specific points about Polanski to comment on the heated, prolonged, and arguably unproductive nature of the debate itself. The language, unbelievably stupid morons, reflects the intense frustration and contempt felt, maybe even toward themselves for getting sucked in. And the phrase, dethroned for top stupid fucking conversation, along with referencing specific past chat events, Urs gaming at John, humorously and perhaps self-deprecatingly ranks their own current exchange as reaching a new peak of online absurdity and pointlessness.
Wow. These detailed examples from the source material really do bring to life that heated, tense, and confrontational description. It wasn't just disagreement. It was battle.
It certainly sounds like it. They show the whole arsenal of linguistic and rhetorical tools. Participants were using everything from direct, brutal insults to complex sarcasm, historical analogy, meta-commentary, all to express their really strong feelings, to challenge the opposing arguments, and maybe just to cope with the sheer frustration of debating such a difficult, emotionally charged, and seemingly intractable issue involving a powerful public figure who has undeniably evaded legal consequences for decades.
Okay, so moving beyond the personal interactions, the specific arguments just related to the 1977 case, the sources also indicate that the conversation broadened out. It expanded to touch on wider implications, systemic issues, connecting Polanski's situation to bigger societal concerns.
It definitely did. The debate, as it's documented in the sources, wasn't just confined solely to the specifics of Polanski's case and Geimer's statements. Participants explicitly drew connections to these larger systemic issues, issues related to justice, power, wealth, inequality.
Like what specifically?
One really significant point raised in the chat and highlighted clearly in the source notes is the perceived disparity in how justice is applied based on someone's socioeconomic status. Participants directly contrasted Polanski's ability to simply evade sentencing by fleeing the country with how a less privileged individual, someone without his resources or connections, might be treated in a similar situation.
How did they articulate that contrast?
One participant made the point very starkly, arguing, if some poor dude from Compton fled from his sentencing, he would get thrown in prison, just straight up. No question.
And this distinction, this perceived inequality, was then used to frame Justin's defense of Polanski within that broader context.
Yes, it absolutely was. A participant explicitly linked Justin's stance, his arguments for essentially letting Polanski off the hook based on Geimer's wishes directly to this systemic issue. They stated quite directly that in their view, Justin wants a rich one-percenter to evade the justice that poor people in the U.S. suffer from.
So that framing shifts the debate significantly.
It does. It positions the debate not just as a disagreement about one specific historical case, but as part of a much larger ongoing discussion about whether wealth and privilege allow certain individuals to operate effectively above the law in ways that are simply not afforded to ordinary people. It connects Polanski's specific case to a critique of systemic injustice.
The conversation also apparently briefly included comparisons to other controversial public figures, expanding the scope beyond just Polanski.
That's right. The sources mentioned that participants made some brief comparisons to other high-profile individuals who have faced accusations or serious scrutiny related to misconduct and a perceived lack of accountability.
Who else was mentioned?
The names mentioned in the source material include figures like Woody Allen, Bill Cosby, whose case was complex and evolving around that time, maybe implying a pattern of delayed or evaded justice historically, Mark Wahlberg, referred to by his old name, Marky Mark, Harvey Weinstein, obviously. And there was even a mention of Meryl Streep's alleged support for Weinstein, which was a separate controversy itself.
So why bring these others up? What's the relevance?
Well, while these comparisons were apparently brief, their inclusion in the source material indicates that participants weren't seeing Polanski's case in total isolation. They were viewing it as part of a broader pattern, a recurring theme concerning powerful figures, often men in the entertainment industry, and the struggles to hold them accountable for alleged or proven misconduct. It contextualizes the Polanski debate within a larger cultural conversation.
And finally, the sources show the debate even touched on more philosophical questions about the nature and purpose of justice itself.
Yes, it seems almost inevitable. That underlying tension we discussed between respecting an individual victim's autonomy and pursuing state accountability for a crime, it naturally leads to these deeper, more fundamental questions, and those surface in the sources.
Like what kind of questions?
The debate implicitly and sometimes explicitly seems to grapple with: what is the primary purpose of the justice system anyway? Is it mainly about punishment for the offender? Is it about rehabilitation? Is it about making the victim whole, which maybe a civil settlement aims to do? Or is it about upholding societal laws and norms, representing the collective will, regardless of individual feelings in a specific case?
And who gets to decide when justice is actually served?
Exactly. Who decides that? Especially in these really complex cases where the formal legal system has been fundamentally circumvented by the perpetrator's own actions, like Polanski becoming a fugitive. That specific debate documented in the sources about whether simply discussing a fugitive online constitutes harassment of a past victim versus whether it's actually a necessary form of critique and advocacy precisely because formal avenues are blocked. That's a concrete example of this philosophical layer playing out in their arguments.
Okay, so to bring this really deep dive into these specific, quite intense source materials to a close, let's just quickly recap what we've unpacked from this exchange. We've seen a debate fundamentally fueled by two starkly opposing interpretations of what it truly means to listen to victims when a crime has occurred, especially a long time ago.
Right. We've meticulously laid out the specific arguments used by one participant, Justin, who primarily drew on Samantha Geimer's stated wishes about forgiveness, about the case being settled, using those as justifications for essentially ending all discussion and any pursuit of Polanski.
And then we've detailed the extensive, really point-by-point counter-arguments, all drawn from the source material. Arguments that emphasize that crucial distinction between personal forgiveness and legal accountability. The principle that the justice system isn't or shouldn't be dictated solely by the victim's feelings. That critical detail that the original settlement was actually rejected by the judge. The undeniable central fact of Polanski's status as a convicted fugitive who fled sentencing. The existence of other serious allegations against him. And the strong challenge to the whole framing of discussing accountability as somehow being harassment of the victim.
Yeah, and we've also looked closely at Polanski's own history of evading justice, specifically as it was presented and debated in these sources, connecting his fugitive status, his perceived pattern of behavior, to arguments about the enabling power of wealth, specific cultural environments, and broader systemic failures of accountability. And of course, we analyzed the volatile tone and the specific tactics, including those sharp personal attacks and cutting zingers that really characterized this particular debate, drawing directly from the source's own descriptions and analysis.
In all of this analysis, every detail, every argument and counter-argument we discussed, every description of the tone and tactics, it's all strictly based on the source materials you provided for this deep dive. It gives us this incredibly detailed, if sometimes, uncomfortable, look at how these incredibly complex and sensitive issues surrounding crime, justice, accountability, especially for powerful individuals, are grappled with in a specific online contest.
It certainly does. It starkly reveals the very different weights the participants in this debate assign to various factors. How much weight do you give an individual victim's stated wishes versus these broader societal principles of accountability, the rule of law, addressing perceived patterns of harmful behavior, especially when the formal legal system has been so deliberately evaded by the perpetrator themselves?
So, reflecting on everything we've explored today from these sources, here is a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. Something drawn directly from the core tensions highlighted in this material. When a perpetrator is a fugitive from justice, actively evading legal consequences for decades, and a victim from one specific, albeit high-profile, past case, expresses a clear desire to move on and considers the matter resolved for themselves. How do we as a society, or even just when we discuss these issues, how do we balance that individual victim's right to pursue their own healing, to define their own path forward, with what many see as the broader societal need for accountability, for upholding the integrity of the justice system, and maybe even for preventing potential future harm? Is there actually a way to genuinely respect and support one while still pursuing the other?
It's a profound question, isn't it? And one clearly without any easy answers, as the sheer intensity and, frankly, the intractability of the debate documented in these sources powerfully demonstrates.
Absolutely. Definitely something to think about long after this deep dive is over.